Hey everyone, welcome to the second ever journal entry. Someone sent me an article the other day about a woman who was hiking the Appalachian Trail, got lost, and ultimately didn't survive. We hear these stories all too often, and instead of criticizing her, I thought her story would make for a useful example of how to prepare in the wilderness if you're ever in such a situation. Let's break it down and see what she did right and where she ultimately fell short. As a bit of background, this woman was 66 years old and set out to hike the entirety of the 2,168-mile Appalachian Trail. She made it more than 1,000 miles before getting lost and disappearing. Now, out of respect for this woman, I'll keep her anonymous, but she's a quick Google search away for those who just can't resist. I will say, however, that she was a retired Air Force nurse and was definitely no rookie, further reinforcing the notion that bad situations can happen to anyone. As the old Boy Scout saying goes, be prepared. Now, logistically, she had her husband meet her at various locations along the way for resupply, so that she didn't have to delay her travels by going out into the cities and then having to come back. She ventured off the trail for a bathroom break and ultimately lost sight of this trail and where exactly she broke off from it. While the idea of losing sight of a trail may seem incomprehensible to some, one needs to realize that when you're in the wilderness, a trail is not a clean, visible footpath that most people are accustomed to. Oftentimes, trail markers are no more than a tree ribbon spaced over two very long stretches apart from one another, or there might be none at all. So if you lose sight of these markers, or you lose sight of where you broke off and continue in the wrong direction, you can very easily lose your way. The unfortunate part was she was reported only like a 10-minute walk away from a trail that led to civilization. But again, you need to put yourself in her shoes and understand how easy it was to get lost and lose your sense of direction in an entirely wooded area like that. Even the authorities themselves later reported difficulty in navigating that portion of the trail. As a personal aside, I enjoy hunting, and I recall one instance where I had to go deep in the woods to set up my spot. And this was in fall when, the trees blend together and the leaves cover any semblance of a trail. And I lost my sense of direction. So it's crucial to be able to cover your tracks and have some sort of reference point. In that particular situation, I hung my bow on a tree branch along with the sweatshirt that I was wearing so that no matter which direction I went, I could always revert back to my original location. So if you go hiking, always bring some sort of colored tape or ribbon that you can use to tie onto a tree. That's just my 2 cents. Now, the sad part about this woman's story is, again, she was only 2 miles from the official trail, the official Appalachian Trail. And many of the texts that she sent to her husband never went through because of a lack of cell phone coverage. And after, a day, maybe not even a day, her husband sounded the alarm to the authorities, who then proceeded to send search and rescue teams to go look for her. The Warden Service expanded the search to include state troopers, national park rangers, fire departments, search aircrafts, and it's reported that the K-9 teams that were sent out, they actually came within 100 yards of where she set up her camp, but they ultimately fell short. It wasn't until 2 years later that the body was found. It was a forester with property nearby. He stumbled across her makeshift campsite and noticed human remains, which were later confirmed to be the correct body. This forester noted that the campsite was incredibly difficult to see unless you were standing right next to it, and much of it had been camouflaged by the trees and the surrounding brush. Now, in hindsight of all that transpired and all that was reported, there were a few takeaways that we can learn from. The first, as I alluded to earlier, is the use of marking your path. If you venture off a trail, make sure to have some sort of identifier of where exactly you ventured off so that you can return and retrace your steps. It would also help to have a second marking, if possible, so that you can orient your direction. So if you have, let's say, for the sake of example, 2 colors of ribbon, say red and blue, you want to tie the red ribbon to one tree and tie the blue ribbon to another tree that's along the path of the original trail. So let's say you're heading southbound, you'd want to tie your red ribbon to a tree, and then you'd want to tie your blue ribbon a little bit farther down, a little bit more southbound down the trail, so that if you get to the red ribbon and you see the blue ribbon in front of you, you know that that was the original direction you were heading. You know that that's southbound. This way, if you do venture off, you just need to find one of the two ribbons, and then you can reorient yourself accordingly. Now, you might ask, well, what if you can't find either ribbon and you walk in the opposite direction and get farther and farther away from the marker? Well, that's why it's imperative to take note of your direction relative to these markers. So, in this particular example with the red and blue ribbon, if you're facing the red marker with the blue marker behind it and you go left, you'll need to remember to go right when you get back. Or, you should really be thinking in terms of, directions, east, west, north, south, but you get the idea. And speaking of which, the elephant in the room here is also have a compass. A compass will unquestionably tell you which direction you came from if you forget. So if you walk 50 paces away from the marker due west, you need to go 50 paces due east to return. The report mentioned that she continued to higher ground in an attempt to find cell phone signal, which in and of itself is not a bad idea, but she didn't mark her way as she did so, which just further and further complicated her location. So she very well could have been walking in circles and all sorts of crazy directions. And, it was reported that she was only a couple miles off the trail, but she very easily could have gone, let's say 10 miles and then returned, but had no idea, right? In terms of the campsite that she set up, there were a few things that she did well and a few that she got wrong. In terms of what she did well, she utilized her surroundings. So she took brush, logs, pine needles, dirt to proper tent up so that any rain that came through didn't get all her stuff wet and she could remain dry. This is crucial to avoid getting wet and risking hypothermia. She also utilized an emergency Mylar blanket. I'm assuming this was to help her insulate herself during, particularly cold nights, or if not, the other use case, which was documented, was, as a cover to try to reflect her location. And she also attempted to make a flag using a branch and a shirt that she had. And it was also reported that she tried starting fires as a distress signal. Now, all of these measures are textbook emergency preparedness protocol. And for that, I do give her credit. Some issues with her setup, however, were that, for one, her whole campsite was cloaked by trees and brush cover. While this may serve to deter wildlife, it makes for a futile attempt by rescue teams and helicopters to identify her. I would argue that she probably should have set up in a more open area. Now, granted, it's hard to know that if you don't have a sense of where you are relative to everything else. But at that point, if it's kind of like a last-ditch Hail Mary effort, you should try to keep moving until you find something that's open. Eventually, it will open up, right? And you can also follow the tree line, and eventually you'll find something that's a little bit more open. Because in these open areas, the sun would have better reflected her Mylar blanket, or the fires that she started would have stood out more. But she had her tent and her whole campsite set up like under trees, so it was really hard for people to find her when they were looking for her. And on the note of starting fires, I kind of have a feeling she might have only started a fire for a night or two and kind of gave up, because lighting a fire every night, it just would have made it that much easier for air crews to spot from above. Maybe she ran out of materials to ignite the fire. Maybe the trees were wet. It's unclear. But as advice for future adventure seekers, if you do find yourself in a situation like this, don't give up. Now, one last thing I would mention is to also carry some sort of whistle on you. Being able to make noise gives you a better chance for people nearby to take note of it. Now, granted, they might have heard it and not thought twice about it, but if they're walking out of the trail and authorities see them and they start asking them questions, like, oh, did you hear anything? Did you see anything? At least they could say, well, I did hear this weird whistle in the woods. I don't know what that was, but maybe that was this person who was lost. So it might provide a lead. And speaking of leads, a funny excerpt that I saw from the official report stated, and I quote, "There were many leads received over the next 26 months, ranging from persons of interest for possible criminal activity related to this person's disappearance, identity theft involving her personal information, geographic information by psychics, sightings in different states, to information suggesting Bigfoot was responsible for her disappearance. All of these leads were investigated with our investigative partners." I think that's pretty funny, but I guess it kind of speaks to, the seriousness that people took any and all lead. The Bigfoot one's a little ridiculous, but in any event. this story is tragic to hear, especially when you hear that these rescue teams were so close, like the canines that were, 100 yards away from where she ended up. But, let's all learn from it and reflect on what went right and what went wrong, and just have it be a learning experience. So don't be afraid of the unknown, but always be prepared. All right, that's it for this week's journal entries. Hope you guys enjoyed. Thanks.